Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human existence.
Hello. It's great to be back. How have you been?
I'm doing really well, thanks. Though I have to admit, preparing for today's topic, it's been pretty eye-opening, a little unsettling even.
I know what you mean, because today we're tackling something I think everyone feels, whether they know it or not.
Right, this modern trend of self-diagnosis and this pervasive feeling that, I don't know, that everyone around us is sick.
Oh, it's everywhere. You see it on social media, you hear it in conversations with friends. People are so quick to use these heavy clinical labels.
Labels like narcissist or bipolar or OCD.
Exactly. For what are often just everyday emotional struggles or, difficult personalities, it's become a kind of shorthand.
It has. And that's what forces us into the really big fundamental question for today. If everyone feels broken, how do we even begin to define what normal is?
And if we can't define normal, how can we possibly recognize what's truly abnormal and actually needs medical help?
That's our mission today. And I think to get there, we have to start with the absolute basics.
The definitions.
The definitions.
Mhm.
Because most people still seem to use psychology and psychiatry as if they're the same thing.
And that confusion is, it's the source of a lot of problems. So let's clear it up.
Please.
At its core, psychiatry is a medical science. It's a branch of medicine. It focuses specifically on the abnormal.
On what's biologically not working right?
Precisely. The goal is to diagnose, treat, and prevent things that are rooted in the biological system. The physiology, the brain chemistry. Our duty is clinical.
But that medical clarity got lost for a while, didn't it? I mean, historically.
It did. In the late 1970s, psychiatry formally split from neurology. And that, along with the fact that psychiatric hospitals, the old asylums, were always physically separate from other hospitals.
Right, they were always on the edge of town.
It created this mystique. It made the field seem less scientific, less grounded than, say, cardiology.
But that's just not the reality anymore. Modern psychiatry is completely different.
It's night and day. We're in the era of neuropsychiatry 2.0, maybe even 3.0. It's evidence-based. We use quantitative tools like fMRI and key-EEG, what some people call brain mapping.
So you can actually see what's happening.
We can see it. We can observe measurable changes in brain activity, say, in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that correlate very strongly with specific disorders. We're moving away from just behavior and toward actual physiology.
Okay, so that's psychiatry, which stands in stark contrast to psychology, the science of human behavior. And that field has its own historical baggage.
It does, especially some of the earlier schools, like psychoanalysis.
Right. The big critique there, and it's a fair one, was the lack of scientific data. This idea that every problem you have as an adult,
Your job, your marriage.
it all comes back to your relationship with your mother or some sexual drive from when you were 3 years old.
And the subtle message there was that just being a person, just being human, meant you were inherently flawed.
And that you needed years and years of therapy to fix it.
It pathologized just being alive. And it also tended to put all the responsibility on your past, on your parents, rather than on your own agency and behavior right now.
So bringing it back to the strictly medical biological lens of psychiatry, when we filter out all the noise, how many actual major illnesses are we really talking about?
It's a remarkably small number. Despite the thousands of ways people can suffer, when you boil it down to what requires direct medical intervention, we're focused on maybe 6 or 7 major diseases.
Things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder.
Exactly. Schizophrenia, bipolar, OCD, true clinical depression, severe anxiety disorders, addiction. Those are the core biological conditions we treat.
So now that we have that firm biological definition of abnormal, we can get to the really tricky part.
It is normal.
Right, the tyranny of the unattainable normal. And what's fascinating is that the word normal itself is actually a pretty recent invention.
Very recent, maybe 200 years old. And it only really took hold in the culture in the last century or so.
Before that, people were just people.
And one of the key insights from sociological thinkers is that when we created the concept of normal, we didn't define it as average or typical,
No, we defined it as an ideal.
as perfection, an unattainable state of being.
And that's the trap, isn't it? If the standard for normal is perfection, perfect happiness, perfect career, perfect family, then by definition, almost everyone falls short.
We all become abnormal, which is why we have to keep coming back to the true medical standard, the one in the diagnostic manuals like the DSM.
And that standard is all about one thing.
Functionality, the loss of functionality.
Let's really dig into that because it's such a crucial distinction. What does that mean in the real world?
It means that if your professional, social, or family life is not significantly impaired. So if you can hold down a job, you can maintain relationships, you can manage your daily life,
Yeah.
then it's generally not considered a disorder that needs medical intervention.
Which is why we can say that so much of modern life is about pathologizing completely normal human emotions.
Absolutely. Sadness, fear, anger, anxiety.
Yeah.
These aren't defects. They are vital signals. They're the consequences of being alive and engaged with the world.
Okay, but let me push back a little. What about, say, the high-functioning workaholic who is making a ton of money but is also deeply miserable and anxious all the time? Their professional function is high.
That's a fantastic question, and it's where the diagnosis gets nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
The criteria do look at subjective distress, not just objective function, but medicine has to draw a line somewhere.
A functional line.
A functional line. If the suffering, no matter how real, doesn't cross over into actual impairment, meaning you can't do your job, you can't sustain a relationship, it moves from being a purely medical issue into an existential or behavioral one.
So even an extreme symptom might not qualify.
Take an extreme example. Someone who hears voices. If that person is still working every day, has a stable family life, and their routine isn't disrupted, that symptom alone might not be enough for a full psychotic diagnosis. The preserved function is a powerful guardrail.
And that guardrail looks nothing like the one society puts up today. I mean, in the past, normal was actually achievable for most people.
It was. Be a devout person, be honest, work hard, have a family, have a job. The margin for what was considered normal was pretty wide.
You could be a factory worker and be seen as a perfectly normal, successful member of society.
But today, the standard is just impossibly high. It's driven by consumerism, by media.
You need the perfect job, the perfect body. You have to be the perfect parent with organic snacks and no screen time.
Plus, you need quality leisure time,
Yeah.
and you need to be consuming all the right things.
And since maybe 1 person in 1,000 can actually achieve that,
The rest of us feel fundamentally deficient, constantly failing. And that feeling of failure,
Yeah.
well, that's a massive market opportunity.
and that brings us right to the crisis of scope, this over-medicalization of everything.
It starts with the very definition of health. You have major global organizations defining health not just as physical well-being, but mental, spiritual, and social well-being.
Which sounds nice, but what does it mean in practice?
It means medical professionals are pushed way, way outside of their expertise. Suddenly, we're expected to have an expert opinion on political elections, or the economy, or some disaster.
Things you never learned about in medical school.
Not for a single second. And it just erodes our credibility. Because when a doctor can't find a real physiological problem, there's this pressure to do something.
Prescribe something, even if it's just vitamins.
Right. It gives this illusion of power, this idea that medicine has an answer for everything, even when it doesn't.
We see that scope creep with language, too. Look at the word trauma.
Oh, it's been diluted almost to the point of being meaningless. It used to mean a specific thing, an event where you face death or a threat to your bodily integrity, combat, a horrific accident, an assault.
And now,
Now people use it to describe being ghosted on a dating app or getting a tough critique from their boss.
so the diagnostic criteria for PTSD becomes impossible to use.
Exactly. If trauma can be literally anything, then the word has no clinical value. We lose the crucial distinction between a life-altering violation and transient emotional pain.
And all this feeds into a huge industry paradox. If we're pathologizing normal life, we have to ask if the treatments are even working.
Well, the numbers are pretty stark. There's data showing that in one country, 65 million boxes of antidepressants were sold, a 76% increase over a decade.
65 million. So if the treatments were really curing the root problem, you'd expect to see the rates of depression go down, or at least level off.
But they don't. The numbers just keep climbing, which forces you to ask, what are these drugs actually doing?
And what's the answer?
They provide what we call a symptomatic window.
A window. Explain that.
The medication adjusts your brain chemistry. It can reduce the sensitivity of certain receptors. It can make neurotransmitters more available. Basically, it turns down the volume on the static and the pain.
It quiets the alarm system.
Exactly. And that quiet gives you the energy, the clarity, the resilience to make the actual changes you need to make in your life.
So the pill doesn't fix your toxic job. It gives you the strength to quit your toxic job.
That is the perfect way to put it. But if you don't make that behavioral change, if you don't leave the job or fix the relationship, the symptoms almost always come back when you stop the medication. because the root cause is still there.
Which brings up that ethical critique about, being in therapy for 5 years for a relationship problem.
Right. It's like the analogy of spending 20 years of your life running marathons just to add 5 years to your lifespan.
You miss the 20 years you could have just been living. The intervention becomes the entire point, instead of a temporary bridge back to a functional life.
So if we put all of this together, where does it leave us?
It feels like we've just swapped one kind of tyranny for another. We got rid of the old, rigid social norms.
And replaced them with this invisible, consumer-driven tyranny, one that makes normal and impossible ever-changing ideal of perfection.
An ideal designed to make you feel like you're always failing.
So you'll buy the next solution, whether it's a pill, a therapy, a wellness product, all just to feel worthy enough to keep up with this crazy itinerary of modern life.
And it means that people in our field, we have to be better at drawing boundaries.
We absolutely do. We are physicians for biology. We are not social engineers. We are not philosophers with the answer to the meaning of life.
Our credibility depends on knowing where our expertise ends.
We have to stop acting like we have the answer to everything. We're specialists, not gods.
Which leaves us with a final, I think, very provocative thought to leave you with. If this entire industry is fueled by a desire for constant happiness and a fear of any kind of discomfort, we have to ask ourselves a pretty deep question.
What is the true cost?
What critical function do things like unhappiness or sadness or anxiety actually serve? They're alarm systems. What happens to us? What happens to our resilience as human beings when we make it our mission to silence those alarms before we've even figured out why they're ringing? That's something to think about.